Let's talk about CSS, guys. So I believe everyone has an idea about what CSS is for, right? What do we do with CSS? Style, fantastic, yeah, we style, colors, yeah, all these things. All right, so do you think CSS is a programming language? No? Yes? It's not a language, but it helps, right? When you create a media query, when you want to apply styles only for mobile, there's some sort of it helps. Well, I believe no one has the answer. There is a big controversial on the internet. Yeah? In one of the conferences I attended a couple of months ago in Amsterdam, so there was a big poll asking senior developers, is CSS a language? 47% of the audience thought it was a language, and 53% said it wasn't a language. But the only thing we know is that technically speaking, it's not considered a language because it's not Turing complete. So there are a bunch of rules, technical rules, to determine whether something can be considered a language, strictly speaking, and CSS is not Turing complete. Anyway, ignoring all these technicisms, I hope we agree that CSS is important. Do you agree CSS is important? Yeah? The question seems stupid. However, you can't imagine how many senior developers tend to underestimate CSS. Yeah? I've never been on an interview where the candidate said, I'm not good at JavaScript because I don't think it's important. That never happened. However, I've been in many interviews where the candidate says, I'm very strong with JavaScript, CSS for the designers, right? That's bad. That's bad. CSS could make the difference between an average developer and a fantastic developer. We're not asking you to be the next Leonardo da Vinci, but at least it's important to have some understanding about how CSS works, how to create a layout, blah. In the long term, many companies struggle to scale to all new features, not because of JavaScript, not because of their infrastructure, but because of CSS. Yeah? If you add a new style to a button and you break other buttons and you do things like that, you struggle to add new components to your application. In other words, CSS is very important. Unfortunately, there haven't been many attempts to standardize the way we use CSS. With JavaScript, there are many style guides and many different things, so everyone can eventually write the same sort of JavaScript. But with CSS, unfortunately, there are many different approaches. Yeah? I'd like to recommend you at the end of this session what's my favorite one. There is a book called SMACS, Scalable and Modular CSS, which is essentially one guy that some time ago decided to establish or to, suggest some development patterns when talking about CSS. The guy was very honest, like, you don't need to agree with me on every single detail, but this is my approach. Yeah, and it's true, I don't agree with him on every single detail, but he's a very super expert in CSS, so the majority of the things that he proposed, maybe I was using them implicitly or maybe not, and for the others, I tend to follow his guidelines. Yeah? I'll send you the link. There is a free version, PDF. It's a very short reading. I think it's like 30 pages or 35, so it's definitely worth to have a look. Yeah. And again, it goes without saying that in a job interview, that gives you lots of points if you can prove, if you can demonstrate that you are comfortable, and at least that you respect CSS and you consider it's very important. Yeah. All right, let's do a bit of CSS. I got an application here, which is fairly simple, right? I got nothing on it. Just some basic React component. So everyone knows what a React component is, right? Yesterday, Gray explained that in the intro to React session. So yeah, I got some JavaScript in here. And now you may have noticed that out of the box, by default, everyone has that. In your main app.js, we are importing something called app.css. Probably you've noticed that already. In other words, we can open app.css and do CSS, yeah, write CSS styles. Cool, fantastic. So the very first thing is, are we comfortable with the layout? I'm not. And you'll see that many times. Before going into details, the first thing I do is to change the Windows layout a bit. I got my VS Code, I got my browser with my hello text in it, but I need to do some sort of ping pong from one to the other. In a very small screen, that may be the only alternative. But if you have a decent laptop, 15-inch, or you have an external screen, that is likely to happen sooner or later. So what I like to do, and again, this is not any standard, this is just my recommendation or my approach. I like to make clear statements when we talk about standards and when we talk about suggestions. Yeah? That's a personal suggestion. My personal suggestion is, if you got the space enough, look, you can snap windows, right? If you are a Windows user, you can simply drag and drop a window to the left and another window to the right. If you are a Mac user, you can hold the maximize button, you can snap it, you see, left or right. So I'll drop VS Code on the left, and then I'll drop my browser on the right. Why? Because now for me it's very easy to do things like, I'll give you an example. I'm going to change the text, hello text is very small on the right hand side. So the first thing, do you know how to increase the size of the text easily with HTML? What? Font? Wrong. Wrong. I'm talking about HTML for now. A tag. What tag? Yvonne? Wrong. Heading. How? Okay. What do we need to type here? Wrong. I don't want to emphasize. I just want to increase the size of the text. H1. Lovely, Yvonne. H1. Yeah. So H1 will essentially make the text bolder. Yeah. Of course, we can fine-tune the behavior of H1 through CSS, but hey, for now that's okay. So now I got my HTML, I got my CSS, I got on the right-hand side my browser, but I'm not ready yet because I'd love to open DevTools on the right-hand side. You remember DevTools? We talked about that yesterday. Yeah. So I got my source code on the left, I got my result in the middle, and I got my DevTools on the right-hand side. Something we didn't mention yesterday explicitly is that with DevTools, we can easily simulate the behavior of our application across many different devices. And I'm particularly talking about mobile devices. So to enable the mobile device view, you see there is a button on top of DevTools, Toggle Device Toolbar. If I click on it, then we can select multiple devices. So, for instance, by default, Chrome offers Galaxy, Pixels, iPhones, whatever, yeah? Be careful with that, guys, because in reality, this is not any sort of simulator. So this is not simulating the hardware like CPU speed, nothing like that. Only the screen size. But hey, as a first step, I think it's good, right? Because I think you agree, it's much easier to quickly prototype your mobile first device looking at this sort of low quality simulator than having to go on your phone all the time, refreshing, blah, blah, blah. By the way, talking about mobile design, do you know, probably you know this already, but if not, that literally from the first minute, you can check the state of your Codeflix application in your physical smartphone. You know you can do that? No? Look, when you start the server, when you run npm start, if you pay attention to the console, you get a very sexy message that says, you can view Codeflix in the browser, localhost 3002. This is what you've been doing so far. But if you go on your phone and you type the IP that is suggested by the DevTools, sorry, by the console, then you can check your Coldflix application in your smartphone, which is pretty nice. Yeah. All right. So let's do a bit of CSS. Right. So the very first thing is let's talk about selectors. So you've seen we got divs, we got H1s, we can have many different selectors. So let me change the example a bit. I'm going to remove my title and I'm going to add another div with a welcome message. So what happens if I want to change the size of that welcome message, which is very small, not using an H1, but using CSS? How do we change the size of that welcome text that you can barely see on the right-hand side? How do we change it using CSS? Font size? Where? Font size? No. Div, all right. What else? Curly braces. Font size, and then whatever, like 100 pixels. Let's see what happens. I think it's large enough, right? A bit smaller, 70 pixels. Yeah, that's the way it works. But now, imagine that we want to add more text at the bottom. So that's a title, and that should be quite big, and that's good, right? I think it's readable enough. However, after the welcome, I want to add some text like CSS rocks and blah, blah, blah. You know, some text. Oh, that's too big, right? I don't want that text to be that big. I just want to have big text on the title, on the first welcome row. What can we do, guys? We have to change the div tag to label. Which one? To label. Okay, let's put a label. Let's put a label and see what happens. Still wrong. Why is it still wrong, guys? Can anyone see? Outside of the div. So Richard, I think, has a different opinion. What do you think? That's correct. That's the problem, guys. So here we said, hey, whenever you find a div, please apply that huge font size. And then you can say, but wait a minute, we don't have a div, we have a label. However, look at what happened. We have a parent div. That's one of the most fundamental, if not the most fundamental, rule in CSS. The styles cascade down. Yeah? Actually, that's the meaning of the C, cascade. It's very honest, CSS, right? The first thing, cascade, so be careful. Okay, so how do we solve it? Do you have any proposal? Classes, I love that, correct. That's probably the best way. So we can change the styles of all the divs of our applications, which, hey, could be scary, but technically speaking, still correct. Or we can use classes, as Parik suggested. So we can do class name equals title. So then only the elements with the class name title will eventually inherit certain CSS styles. So what do we need to change here? Because that's still wrong, right? So we added the class title, but that's still wrong. What do we need to do? Change the div to dot what? Why dot? Parik? That's correct. In CSS, the way you refer to classes is with a dot. Yeah? And now you can see that it's actually correct, right? You get a huge title, but anything else is not affected by the title. Yeah? Of course, if we believe that that text is still very small, can we do that? Can we add div font size 25 pixels? Look, or even 30 pixels. So what that means? That means that every element inside of div, everything is inside of a div in my application, will take by default a font size of 30 pixels, unless we overwrite it. So if we pay attention on the right-hand side to the CSS inspector in DevTools, look at what happened in our description. So let me zoom that a bit. You will see, probably you can see div, font size, 30 pixels. But on the title, look at what happened. We still got that CSS because it cascades down, but I hope you can see it's a strike through. Like, yes, you try to apply that. However, this is not actually taking any effect because that rule has been overwritten. You see? We'll have a specific workshop to talk about how do we predict which CSS rule will win. That's one of the big headaches in CSS development. That CSS rules may conflict, may clash. Yeah? So we'll do a workshop about specificity to be able to orchestrate the CSS appropriately. Yeah? So that's the basic way CSS works. Let me do something. Let me replace, no, that's okay. So div class name title. Let's talk about colors. How do we change the color of the title?
Sorry, before you go ahead.
Yeah.
Does it matter in which sequence?
That's a good question. That's a good question. We'll talk about that on the specificity in detail, on the specificity workshop, but for now, if I change that and I hide my browser to avoid the spoilers, what do you think, guys? Do you think now our title should be 70 pixels or 30?
I think 70.
Why 70, Parek?
Because when I was looking at CSS previously, I remember seeing where if you've got nothing before the tag, so say divs got nothing prior to it, then that would be on the lowest of the hierarchy. Then you go up to classes where that would be more important, and then IDs go above classes.
Yeah, correct. That's correct. This is because of a specificity. Even though CSS is processed in chronological order from top to bottom, in reality, that's not enough to determine which rule is the eventual winner in this battle. Some rules are more specific than others. Class selectors are more specific than tag selectors. That's why even if we put the title before the div, in reality still wins, right? In other words, it doesn't matter if that title is before or after the div, right? Any other questions? No? All right, so then let's talk about colors. How do we change the color of our title? Color? Give me a color, Abdul. Green. Fantastic. You can see it works, right? Cool. And how do we change the color behind the title, in the background? Background color. Background dash color, I like that. Nice. Background dash color yellow, for instance, right? And what happened? Yeah.
So I was going to say, are those attributes to the title class and are these properties or attributes, or technically what do you call them?
So these are CSS properties that apply on that CSS rule. Every property has a key and a value. Cool. And what happened if, okay, that's looking good. We like this Brazilian style, if you like it. If we want to have some space between the text and the limits of our box. Margins and padding. That's very interesting one. Which one?
I
You will set margin. What do you think? A nice looks like it's not happy with that.
It's going to go for padding.
Padding. What's the difference between padding and margin? That's very important. Which one?
Inside and outside.
That's correct. Inside and outside of the yellow box. So which one is inside, padding or margin?
You can check on their tools.
Of course. And on Google as well, right? Right. The space between the content and the box, the inner space, is determined by the padding. Yeah? In other words, if I add a padding of 15 pixels, yeah, it's inside of the box. A border. Well, that's a good question. How do we add a border to the yellow box? Border. And then what? Semicolon. Colon. Dash. Dash. That's it? It doesn't work, right? Why?
You haven't defined how wide you want it.
Okay, how do we build that expression?
Usually I just go border, colon, solids, 1 pixel, and then like black.
Yep, it does work. It's hard to see, but if we change 1 pixel to 10 pixels, I hope you see it works, right? It's fair to say that generally speaking, historically speaking, the width of the border is set up first. In other words, first we put the width of the border, then the style of the border, and finally the color of the border. So let's change black to blue. You see it works, yeah? Do you know any other styles apart from solid?
Yeah.
Which ones?
There was dash.
Dash.
So ED on the end.
You see? Dash. We got dotted. Yeah, there are a few styles, right?
That's the hierarchy. It's got to be different.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's the way border work. And then another question. You referred to margins before. The margin is the space between the boundaries of this box. The boundaries are defined by the border, the blue boundaries, and every surrounding element. So imagine that we want to have some gutter, some space between the limits of our smartphone and our title. We can add a margin of, for instance, 10 pixels, and look at what happened. You see? It's pretty nice, right? We can style our application.
So you said the margin is what?
Margin is the outer space. The space between the element and its neighbors, if you accept the expression. Beyond the border. All these three rules, padding, border, and margin, they represent what we call in CSS the box model. Yeah, that's another classic job interview question. What the box model is? The box model is the rules that determine the sizing of the box on the screen. And this is based on the combination of essentially the padding, which is the inner space, the border, which determines the boundaries, and the margin, which is the outer space, the space between the boundaries of the element and any sibling, any neighbor. Thankfully, with Google DevTools, we got a very visual way to analyze the box model of a given element. Let me show you. You will see a tab in the Elements panel, somewhere, depending on where you have DevTools, called computed styles. Yeah, so if you click on computed styles, look at how nice this is. Yeah, it's fantastic. This is the box model in a very visual way. And you can, look, if you don't remember if margin is inner or outer, Chrome is telling you, you see, margin, border, and padding. If you hover any of these elements, it's a bit hard to see because of the resolution, but maybe you can see, let me zoom it a bit, see if it helps. No, I cannot zoom it, unfortunately. That is highlighting in orange where the margin is. Can you see that? Yeah? And of course, same with the border, you see? So you can essentially have in real time feedback about how much border, padding, and margin do you have. And of course, you can also highlight the content, right? All these things. So this is the most fundamental way of dealing with CSS. Let me recap. You have, generally speaking, a class name. And then on that class name, you set up things like padding, border, and margin. What happens if I want to add a second title? Can I reuse that class name? Or do I need to create a new one? Correct. So, welcome to Codery. You see? I didn't have to add any new CSS. And that's one of the beautiful aspects of styling. As far as I assign the same class name, every element with that class name will inherit the same styles, which is pretty nice, I believe, right? Cool. Do you have any questions?
For a question about this semicolon.
Semicolon.
You need it in CSS, but in JavaScript. I know you need it, but in Word, without it. You know what I mean?
Key value stuff in objects.
All right. What happens if we delete the semicolons? Look at what happened. It's not working. It's not working. In other words, semicolons are strictly necessary. Missed semicolons. Yeah? Ewan is right. In JavaScript, they are not necessary anymore. But they used to be necessary not far ago, not a long time ago. Yeah? JavaScript and CSS are different standards, which means they can evolve following different decisions. JavaScript standard decided to not having mandatory semicolons. CSS standards decided to keep them. My suggestion is always use them. Syntax sugar. Yeah? So this is the very basics about CSS. We'll have obviously other sessions. So for instance, we'll have a dedicated session to talk about Flex and Grid. If you're curious about Flex and Grid, you can train it using the Codery platform. That's an intermediate UA training. And something that we won't do officially, but I encourage you to do, is to talk about things like less. In other words, you know that next month, everyone will be invited to do a workshop. We'll have a list of topics that you can actually talk about. One of these topics will be less CSS. Do you know what less CSS means? Yeah? All right, so let me explain the problem first, and that will be the last thing of the day. Imagine that your corporate color, right, your main color is yellow. And that means that every time you do something, whatever, color yellow, background color yellow. In other words, you have 2,000 CSS files, and you got the yellow color spread in many different CSS rules, right? Hard-coded. But one day, business realized that yellow is probably not the best corporate color, and they decide to change it to blue, for instance. You see the problem. We need to replace the yellow color thousands of times because it's hard-coded. With less CSS, you may have heard about SAS as well, so there is not the only alternative. It's like a meta language on top of CSS where we can do things like creating variables. You know, in JavaScript, you can create a variable and you can reuse it as many times as you want. With less CSS, we can create CSS variables. So you can create a variable, that won't work here, of course, called primary color, yellow. And you declare it only once, which means that every time I use it, instead of hard coding yellow, I put my primary color. So if tomorrow I change my primary color to yellow to blue, how many times do I have to change that? Only once, yeah, which is pretty convenient. This is one of the advantages of less CSS, but there are many others. We can create mixins, which are some sort of functions. We can nest CSS rules, so we can do many things with less CSS. So again, this is not part of the official training program because we want you, first of all, to learn CSS, but if anyone likes CSS and if anyone wants to have some really good understanding about CSS, you'll have the opportunity to do a workshop about less CSS. And that will be very beneficial towards employment, yeah? Because less CSS is very appreciated in the market. Anything else, guys? No? Cool. Thank you very much. See you later.